For as long as I can remember, Cowboy McFarland has come to Gilman School for Pioneer Day. He has taught our boys how to lasso, he taught them about the Cowboys Code, and he told us why the Gilman Five matters. This year, we are especially appreciative to him and his son Zane for taking us on a virtual ride through their journey on their trail. Saddle up, boys. It's going to be an exciting journey. Have fun.
Hold it a foot or two away from where this sliding knot is. And that way the loop stays open. If you hold it too close, the loop will collapse. So you've got to hold it a little ways away. The other complicated thing is you've got to be able to let these coils go, but hold the last one. Now this takes a little bit of training, so don't expect perfection. Then you're going to go, I'm going to bring your hand back, and you watch my wrist. So I'm going to bring it up, wrist forward, flip back. Wrist forward, flip back. Forward, back. So it looks really easy, but it's not that easy. And you can rope, you can rope either the head of a horse or a cow, or you can, as in rodeos. The mask on. Oh, good. Remember to throw it high. Dominic. Now throw it high, really high, and let your hand go. Here we go. Another couple times around. There you go. Throw it now. Throw it. Oh, yeah! Good job. Wow, you got the whole animal.
All right.
Remember to throw it like a baseball, okay? Oh, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling to throw it at the top of it. Make sure you let your hand go. A couple more times around. Throw now. Throw! Oh! Woo! Got my hat. It's forward. Got it with my thumb on top. I'll flip it around like that, then put it on my head. Okay, now you got to do it fast though. So something like that. So anybody want to try it with me? 1, 2, 3.
Oh! Okay, hi first graders. It's great to see you today. Thanks for joining us. And today I have a special treat for you. I have Ian and Zane McFarland here visiting with us. And when I started working at Gilman years and years and years ago, Zane McFarland, wave Zane, say hi. He was, gosh, how old were you then? Would you have been, I guess, maybe a sophomore, I think. And so he played the fiddle, and on Pioneer Day, Zane would come and he would play the fiddle, and we would sing around the campfire. And Ian McFarland, we call him Cowboy McFarland. Say hi, Cowboy McFarland. He would come.
Howdy.
He would come and tell us all about his adventures out west and on the trail. And so we're going to do a little bit of that today. So I'm going to ask them some questions, and I'm going to take really good notes. And if you have questions as you're watching this, you can ask me later, and I will do my very best to answer what they didn't get to today. All right, guys, so saddle up. Here we go. All right, would you guys take a minute just to introduce yourselves to our first grade friends?
Sure will. Howdy, first graders. I'm Cowboy McFarland. I'm actually a Gilman grad of 79. That would be 1979. So I've been at it for a while. And one of my joys in my life was that I worked in Wyoming for 7 summers and 1 fall in elk hunting camp. And I was a wrangler for an outfitter and worked in the back country of Wyoming and Yellowstone and learned the lore of cowboys. So I hope to share a little bit of those stories with you today. And Zane followed in my footsteps to some degree. Take it away, Zane.
Hey, I'm Zane. I am also a Gilman graduate. I was actually sitting in your shoes at one point. I was in 1C. and always remember Pioneer Day was the best day. I used to come back and play the fiddle. I still play the fiddle every now and then, but I followed my dad's footsteps. I also worked in Wyoming as a wrangler at a dude ranch, and I rode lots of horses and had a lot of adventures in the mountains. And I did that for 3 summers. I loved the mountains so much that I decided I wanted to keep hiking around in them. And I actually took some time off in college to spend 5 months hiking on the Continental Divide. That's the Rocky Mountains. So I love the mountains and I love horses.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, what an exciting time for you both. So we have been talking a lot about animals on the trail and animals that pioneers would have run into. And so the boys have been asking lots of questions about, what were some of the dangers on the trails with regard to animals. And so we have been talking about sort of coyotes, what we would see if there were bears or rattlesnakes, and what the pioneers would have done in those circumstances. And so, of course, that was in 1849. I was wondering if you could talk about if you had any interesting encounters with animals along your journey.
Oh my goodness, yes. I will let Zane talk about any modern times, but in my day, there were no wolves. The wolves were repopulated in Yellowstone after I finished my tenure there, but we had a number of I'd say dangerous animals that we could encounter. Rattlesnakes were around where I was in Wyoming, but they only lived at low altitudes, and my ranch and where I packed on mules and horseback in the backcountry of Yellowstone was much higher in altitude, so snakes didn't really live up there, so we rarely encountered a rattlesnake. What we did encounter was, I call them the big three: moose, buffalo, and bears. Those are the big three. I've definitely been chased by a moose. Luckily, I was on a horse when that happened. When I got away, I've run into many buffalo, and buffalo can be very dangerous. They're in the backcountry Yellowstone. We just tried to stay away from them because they can chase you and gore you, and you don't want that to happen. Moose are also, you wouldn't think moose are dangerous, but they can be, particularly when they have a mama moose and a calf. And I remember being on horseback one time in a lowland area in some brush, and I saw a moose and a calf, and she saw me, and I wasn't that far away, maybe 10, 15 yards, and she came charging after me. And luckily, my horse was faster than she was, so we outran her. But thankfully, because they have big racks of horns. But you guys have probably talked about bears, and bears you got to be careful of. Uh, there are black bears and there are grizzly bears, and grizzly bears are you should be afraid of them all, but grizzly bears are bigger and meaner. And one summer I saw 7 grizzly bears, and I'll tell 2 very quick stories on grizzly bears. One of them, in that summer I saw 7, and I saw a few every year, but I was on my horse leading on my pack train with mules behind me, and the guests, the campers were behind them, all riding horses. And we were in a very timbered up, very woody area in the mountains. So there was no way to get off the trail. And I was coming around a corner, and my horse started shivering. And then the whole horse, when it shivers, man, you're shaking. And I went, "What's going on?" And I spurred my horse. I kicked my horse along to say, "What's going on?" We came around the corner, and there was a grizzly bear with a cub. And that's the worst situation because mama grizzly bear is going to try to protect the baby. She stood up. She was about, I don't know, 15 feet, 10 yards away from me, maybe less, 15, 20 feet. She stood up on her hind feet, growled and frothed at the mouth, and my horse freaked out. And my horse went straight up in the air with me on his back and flipped around, slammed me into a tree. Thankfully, I didn't fall off. And by the time I looked around, the mama grizzly bear had started running back up the trail away from us. So thankfully, and I went up and put my foot inside the footprint of the grizzly bear, and my entire foot fit inside the footprint. So
Wow.
this footprint was huge. Um, so we waited a while because the horses were very upset. They are in danger as well. Um, and later that summer, I was hiking with a friend, not on horses, above the tree line where trees can't grow, up on the big ridge of a mountain. And we were coming down, and on a ridge kind of next to us, we saw a mama grizzly bear again with, I think, two cubs, these were silver tip, and they were very distinctive. They were brown and with silver highlights. And about the same time we saw the bears, they were about 100 yards away. They saw us, and so we started running down into the valley where there were some low-lying trees, so we could figure out how to hide. And the bears started running down at the same time, and they can run fast. So we both got to the tree line, converged to the tree line at about the same time. We heard them crashing into the trees, and thankfully they never found us. I'm sure they were looking, but that was scary. I was very scared.
Yeah.
Um, in any case, we had lots of run-ins with bears, but they would come into our camp sometime and steal saddles and try to get food. And they can be very dangerous. You just stay out of their way. Zane, did you run into any interesting critters?
Yeah, when I was hiking, actually, I was hiking when I was going through southern Wyoming. I actually it was near where I crossed the Oregon Trail, actually, sort of in the plains of the Great Divide Basin, or the Great Basin of Wyoming. And because it's lower lying and it's more of a desert and there's lots of sun and it's sort of those open plains, rattlesnakes love that area. So I have a specific memory of hiking along a dirt road and sort of not paying attention, keeping my head up, looking around at just the beautiful scenery. And then all of a sudden, right in front of me, 5 feet in front of me, is a coiled up rattlesnake, and it was rattling its rattle. And that was pretty scary because it could have probably striked at me. So from then on, I was very in that sort of area around the Oregon Trail there. You had to keep your eyes on the ground just to make sure that you're not coming up on any rattlesnakes because they're dangerous.
What did you
Let's
do?
see. What did I do? Oh,
Yeah.
I had to go really around it on the trail. So I had to go off of the trail and I had to go around it.
Okay.
It seemed pretty angry.
Ooh.
Yeah. Um, let's see. Anything else? I definitely saw when I was on horseback. I've seen a bunch of black bears before, but I never saw a grizzly bear on horseback myself. However, when I was hiking in the in the backcountry of Yellowstone, I was by myself hiking for a couple days, and I was trying to actually make it to the ranch where I used to work, and I had two grizzly run-ins. One was pretty distant. I had just gotten on top of a mountain. I looked down below, about 100 yards down the basin. A grizzly bear was looking at me, um, and it sort of, I don't know. I think if it was a person, it would have waved and then just sort of walked away in the direction where I had to walk.
Right.
So when you're in the backcountry in those parts, you sort of especially when you're alone, you need to sort of make noise just so that you alert any bears in the area of your presence, just so that you don't startle them. So if you would have seen an instant replay of me through those days, you would have seen someone by themselves singing all sorts of songs and just sort of hollering in the woods by himself.
That's pretty
And
great.
the next day, actually, I had just eaten dinner and I was hiking down switchbacks, sort of back and forth down a steep ridge, and it was sunset, and animals are a lot more active at sunset. So it's not typically, I shouldn't have been hiking at that time, but I was hiking down, and I was tired, so I was quiet, which was a mistake because all of a sudden I hear some sticks break behind me, and I think it's the wind, but I turn around, and about 10 feet behind me on the next switch back up for me is a grizzly bear, and it was a silver tip too. It has these sort of silver edges. It almost looked like it was black and white. And I reach
They're
for
even more scarier when they're that color. That's for
yeah,
sure.
yeah, and their eyes were very dark, and the area around the eyes was very dark, and it was, I mean, I froze, and I went, oh, and I reached for my bear spray, which is sort of spray that you can use if a grizzly bear comes at you, you can spray it, and they sort of it's supposed to help deter them and turn them away. So I was reaching for it, and the grizzly bear makes a whoo, and just sort of bolts the other direction away from me and goes crashing through the woods away from me. So I was lucky in that it decided to not charge at me, but rather away from me.
Yeah, that I would say that was a lucky thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering, I'm just thinking about you, Cowboy McFarland, as a dad during that time. You know, I can remember you telling me stories about when Zane was gone. And, you know, I feel like I remember you telling me that there was a GPS tracker that you could sort of know where he was, but there was no
Yes.
communication with him.
Right.
And so um, I'm just wondering, how did that feel as a dad to know that your son was out in the wilderness with what you know could happen?
Oh yeah. Well, that was not a fun time because I only learned about these things after the fact. If
Sure.
since he was by himself, he could have gotten eaten up, and we would have never known.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a bit heart palpitation moment for sure.
Well, you know, I've been
And there were a
thinking,
few others like that as well along that hike of the Continental Divide Trail.
well, we've been talking a lot about things that, you know, how our first graders can think of things that are the same about pioneers and that are different than pioneers. And I think, you know, even from 1849 to now, that would be a thing. You know, families back home didn't know what their loved ones were experiencing because there wasn't communication, right? And so,
That's right.
so
That's
even
right.
now, like that was a challenge for you, it sounds like.
Yes. I think the culture of the West kind of, you feel that people are very independent. They're very aware of their setting around them and
Mhm.
the all the good and the bad that comes with it.
Hmm.
And people are very resilient because of it.
So it's interesting that you use that word resilient. You know, at Gilman, we talk a lot about the Gilman Five and we teach our boys
Mhm.
a lot about the Gilman Five. And I will tell you, I'm sad that you are not getting to meet this group of first graders. They're a wonderful, wonderful group of guys.
Mhm.
And they really strive to live their life by the Gilman Five. And
Mhm.
over the years, you have taught me about the cowboy code and how the cowboy
Yes.
code is a little bit like the Gilman Five. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
It is, and let me flash up a different background, and you probably won't be able to see this. I'll get out of the way here in a moment. But they call it the Code of the West, and there have been books written about the Code of the West, and it's similar to the Gilman Five in that it puts forth a way of doing things, and an honorable way of doing things. And cowboys and wranglers and the folks that work in the West in this kind of setting, they have to be independent, and they have to be honorable with each other. And this Code of the West is developed, and I'm going to step out of the way here for a moment. You can see the first few are live each day with courage. Uh, I'm reading backward because there's a mirror view here. What's the second one?
Take
Uh,
pride in your work.
take pride in your work. There's one down there. It's called ride ride for the brand.
Mm,
What's that all about? That's about being honorable to the group you belong to.
hmm,
Um, so there are many of these things that the cowboys and wranglers kind of grew up with and believe that are very similar to the Gilman Five, and it's about integrity, honesty, respect, humility, being humble. And what's the other Gilman Five one? I can't remember off the top of my head. Zane?
Excellence.
I was going to say,
Excellence. There you go. Excellence. There's a few on here in the code of the West that are like that. Like make sure you finish what you start, etc.
yeah. So,
So they're very similar,
so I love that
and I love
you're
it.
looking at that. I love that finish what you start. Do you have,
Yes.
talk to me about that. Why would that be important?
Well, I'm just trying to think of an instance. When people are relying on you, when you're out in a harsh environment like the West, like the pioneers lived, you've got to make sure you're relying upon what other people are doing. One
Mhm.
of the little rules out in the West, which I learned very hard and I carry through today, is always leave a gate like you found it. So if a gate is open in the middle of the wilderness with a fence, and it was open, you just don't close it
Mm,
because somebody left it open for a reason. Maybe the cattle have to go through there to get water. So start what you finish is all about if you've told people you're going to do something, like repair a fence or shoe a horse, uh, they're depending upon you doing that, and
right.
they're counting on it.
To
So people are depending upon you,
yeah,
and that's why that phrase is there.
what about you, Zane? Can you think of any time? Like, I'm just thinking
Mm-hmm.
you finished what you set out to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so how did
Yeah,
that feel when
definitely.
you accomplished that?
Yeah, I mean that was a great feeling. I mean, I set out on the Continental Divide Trail. I had one goal in mind, and that was to make it from to Canada. You start in Mexico and you hike all the way to Canada. So that was sort of always in my mind, finish what I started. And that was one of the driving forces in my hike. Even when the going got tough, there were plenty of days that were rainy and sad, and but I'd set out to do something, and I really wanted to stick to it. And the ultimate, when I finished, it was one of the best feelings I've ever had in my life, just because it was one of the biggest goals that I've set for myself, and completed. And it was a big learning moment for me that you can set large goals and you can complete little tasks along the way, but if you keep at them and you keep persisting, then you can achieve something uh, that it's bigger than what you thought. And then one instance of finishing what you start, I specifically remember being a wrangler on the ranch that I worked, and part of my duties as a wrangler was to take care of the spaces where we would keep our horses.
Mm,
So one of those spaces was a large open area, and there's fence around it. Um, and so, I mean, this fence, Wyoming winters are rough. And so at the beginning of every season, the fences need a lot of repairing, so that the horses don't escape, and they don't escape into either neighbors' yards, or they don't escape and run down to the highway, which you don't want horses running on a road, because that's just dangerous for everyone. So one of my first duties when I get to the ranch in the season is to go out and ride along the fences and fix any spots on the fence. And my boss would rely on me to tell him that I finished fixing all the fence. Therefore, we can put all the horses out there, and we don't have to worry about the horses
right.
running away.
That's awesome. So I'm picturing, my backyard with a fence. I imagine that the ranch was probably not like that.
No, it was sort of it's a very bare fence. I mean, it's barbed wire. So it's just two or three strings of wire, with little
Like spikes
prickly
on them.
prickly
Yeah.
barbs in it. Yeah, just so that when horses go near them, they know not to mess with the fence. And so and they're held together by these things called T-posts. And so when you're building new fence, you have to go out into a field and you have to bang the T-posts in all day. And so I've had many afternoons chapping my hands,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's
So,
Yeah, that's hard work.
so
We
would
all did it.
would it be like bigger than Gilman's property, smaller than Gilman's property? What would you say?
I think the area that I think the area where we would let the horses out was about equal. It was about the field was
Uh-huh.
about equal to the size of Gilman's total campus.
Okay. So it's not a
However,
small area though.
so it's not a small area. You need to get around on horseback. Um, however, there was a fence on the civilization side, but the ranch lived next to a national forest in a mountain. So on that side, there was no fence. So the
Okay.
horses actually, if they wanted to, they could go up the mountain if they wanted. So
Wow.
every morning we would have to wrangle the horses down so that we could saddle them and ride them. And so every morning I would set out with the other wranglers and we go riding around looking for the horses. And the
Um,
horses have they have their own little groups and they have their own little cliques and packs and friendships that they, Shiloh would hang over in the marsh where we know, so we one person would go that way and then the other person would go to this different area. So usually we get them in about an hour, but sometimes there were a couple horses that were farther than we anticipated.
wow. So I'm thinking about wrangling the first graders at recess. And it's a little similar sometimes, right? Because they have their little groups, and sometimes you have kids on the field playing, and sometimes
Absolutely.
you have kids doing imaginary games, and
Yeah.
it's yeah,
I lost in the mountains one time on a pack trip. Our horses, you'd picket one horse
yeah,
that a lot of the other mules and horses liked, and usually they'd stick around in a meadow where that picket horse was. But sometimes they would get ornery, particularly if there was a rebel in the group, and
yeah.
they would take off. And my worst event was it took me 2 to 3 days to get them all back. I think
Oh my
I
gosh.
had to ride 20 or 30 miles to go find them. So I had to track them. You have to track their footprints and figure out where they went, and then go find them and wrangle them up and bring them back.
So
All good times.
so why was it important to make sure that you got the horse that went away?
Well,
Like I can
you
imagine that.
might never see them again, so you want your horses because you need your horses, and we were and people are either riding them, they're supposed to be riding them, or packing supplies on them. So without them, you couldn't go anywhere,
Right,
uh, and so they were our main mode of transportation.
right. So it was worth it was important to you to,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah,
Yes.
that's
And that too, and I would be fired if I didn't bring all the horses back.
sure.
So, yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I so thank you very much for taking your time and sharing your stories with us. Is there anything that you want to leave our Gilman first graders with?
Well, gosh, first graders, I'm going to come back to that Gilman 5 thing. Is really think about those through your life at Gilman, because they apply to everything. What I learned at Gilman and then in the West in Wyoming, um, has helped me through my whole life, and it makes us a little different. So, and good people. So please try to remember them and live by them. Live by the code of the West. You're learning a lot with Pioneer Day. So try to live up to all of that. It's tough sometimes, but it's worth it. Zane, any parting words from you?
I think you said it pretty well. I think if there are any big adventures that you have in mind, it's always worth trying to pursue them, and you might meet some great people and fun people, and you learn things along the way that you'll take with you forever. So, if there's an adventure out there, try to do it.
That's
And
great.
always have a howdy smile on your face.
That's really great. Well, one of the things that I have learned from both of you is that you both seem very committed to making wherever you go better than when you got there. And so, we talk to our kids a lot about that. And so what great role models you are both to them. So I appreciate that. And thank you so much again for taking your time, and we wish you well on your journeys and on your trail.